Hello everyone, today we talk about the county of Anjou between 861 and 1360, originally being just a small French polity, eventually expanding in the High Middle Ages to become one of the greatest powers and probably the land of origin, in fact, of one of the most, or some actually, of the most powerful dynasties in Europe at the time, and finally being incorporated in the, first of all, elevated to Duchy of Anjou, and eventually being part, I think, properly of the French royal domain in 1482. And the original area essentially overlapped properly as a county to the diocese of Angers, that was also the center, the city center of the county, and its position is quite interesting because it was bordered by quite powerful neighbors that in fact caused some problems, especially at the beginning, to its integrity. Brittany to the northwest, Maine in the north, it's basically in between Normandy and Anjou, Touraine in the northeast, and Poitou to the south. So these are all names that recur, as you understand, in French history and in the broader sum, especially of possessions that would make up the so-called Plantagenet Angevin Empire, as it's sometimes called properly. This sum of dynastic possessions led fundamentally by the Kingdom of England, but in fact with an Angevin, properly French dynasty. And the origins of the land, was also the same name, came from the Gallic Andes people, who were conquered by Julius Caesar, who organized the Roman civitas of the Andecavi, the place. And in late antique, early medieval times, the area declined in some way, as the first Frankish district named in Anjou is named Pagus, so a sort of essentially a village that eventually would evolve, however, into a comitatus, as the standard district name for the Frankish administrative repartition, and it consolidated as such further at the beginning of the reign of Charles the Bald. However, the Anjou was still somewhat reduced in power, so much that it was diminished by foreign expansion, especially the one of the Duchy of Brittany. Lambert, a former Count of Nantes, devastated Anjou, together with Nominoy, Duke of Brittany, so that by the end of the year 851, Lambert had occupied all the western part of Anjou as far as the Mayenne River. And things would remain like this fundamentally up until the beginning of the 10th century, as the Dukes of Brittany, starting from Erispoe, that had fundamentally occupied the area at the death of Lambert, in turn would retain control of this part of the Anjou. And in the meanwhile, the Norman raids hit hard the entire region, as you know, crippling significantly also the capacity of a local ruler to expand further the system. And it would stay, in fact, like this up to the beginning of the 10th century, when the raids began to slow down. And needless to say, in fact, for whoever stayed there and the potential of the land, still an important ruler was required. And the chroniclers of Anjou name as the first count Tertullus, who was elevated, as many at the time, from obscurity by the same Charles the Bald, that, as you know, was trying essentially to keep hopelessly his Western Frankish kingdom together at that point. And this Tertullus was possibly, or probably, the father of the later Count Angevin that would have started the ruling dynasty of Anjou, albeit in between, at some point, we don't know the chronology, also Robert the Strong, so the ancestor of the Saint Capetians, because these were the Count of Paris, had also been given, among the other possessions, the same Anjou by Saint Charles the Bald around 861. Robert died in 866 at the Battle of Brissac against the Normans. Right, these were actually Danish and Bretons that had besieged Brissac. The Western Frankish coalition came to essentially besiege them in the same fortress that they had occupied, and when they broke out, Robert was killed, and other leaders were killed. Frankish leaders were killed as well, or significantly wounded and damaged, and so on. So at that point, as Count of Anjou, rose Hag the Abbot, a member of the Welf family, a son of Conrad I of Auxerre, and this is also typical. There were some ecclesiastical rulers at this point taking over the local situation, so because connected properly with important assets, right? And at Hugues' death in 886, the county of Anjou passed to Odo, that was Robert's eldest son. And Odo became King of France in 888 after Charles the Fat. And at this point, he seems to have already delegated the country between the Maine and the Mayenne River to the aforementioned Angevin as Viscount, because or Count around 870. We don't know whether he maintained, namely the countship of Anjou as Western Frankish king, but in any case, providing the de facto control to Angevin, probably being favored because of the connections of his wife Adelaide of Amboise, that came from an influential Frankish family of the Loire Valley. And these areas were quite important strategically, because the Loire naturally was mainly the entrance of most of Norman raids at the time, so it was important to have an important figure controlling the area. So Angevin and Adelaide's son Fulk the Red succeeded his father holdings in 888. He's also mentioned later in 898 as Viscount, and seems to have been granted, or maybe he usurped, the same title of Count by the second quarter of the 10th century, which is very interesting. First of all, because you see it's prolonged rule that manifests not just a success, but also in the darkest hour of the second invasions, and this was typical especially of Western Francia. You would have a big deal of usurpation of public titles because of the de facto seigneuries that were being formed at in this quite let's say rich area that, in spite of the raids, etc., could afford, in fact, the local rulers to build the seigneuries. In fact, Anjou rose, like as many other, there were really many counties in Western France, but Anjou is one of the main, say, seigneurial states emerging by the 11th century in Saint France to great power. We will see how. Right, there is properly a military capacity of its leaders that successfully consolidate a hell of a state, a pretty well defended one, etc. And Fulk the Red's descendants continued to bear the rank of counts of Anjou for 3 centuries to come. And this this manifests naturally the fait accompli, say, of the succession to the country wherever it had happened, like the jure de facto. It was recognized in the kingdom, who in turn was succeeded by Geoffrey I, known as Gray Tunic, Gris Gonel, around 958. The latter inaugurated an important expansion phases that would effectively consolidate the county of Anjou, as remembered before, as a main power in western France. And there was an immediately evident objective that could be backed also juridically. That was the reconquest of the territories lost, usurped, conquered from the therefore separated from the ancient countship rule, and this equated naturally going at war with the neighbors. Not much because of Brittany at this point, because since the beginning of the 10th century, Western Anjou had been recovered from the dukes of Brittany. It was rather in the east, and so against other Western Franks, that the especially Saumur had been seized by the counts of Blois and of Tours. Right, so the county of Blois and the Touraine were very, especially the former formidable powers in Western Francia already. So Geoffrey Gray Tunic managed to make, first of all, the Count of Nantes his vassal, right? So securing an important political stability in the northwest. Also, he received the concession in fief of the district of Loudun by the also powerful Duke of Aquitaine, so receiving his support as well. Geoffrey Gray Tunic is a warrior count. He was sung because of his deeds and feats of arms, as he participated in the Western Frankish army at the time of King Lothair, against the Normans and also against the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II, distinguishing himself in the process. Geoffroy's son, Fulk III, Nera, that is the Black, ruling between July the 21st, 987 and June the 21st, 1040, was also a great warrior, and he earned a reputation for his pilgrimages he took to Jerusalem to atone for his deeds. Remind, this is before the First Crusade, so this shows also how it was normal at the time already, just for the Westerners to visit the Holy Land, and also, with all the risks attached. And he found himself against a powerful coalition of Otto I, Count of Blois, and Conan the First of Rennes, that would have become also Duke of Brittany shortly afterwards. This happened properly at the accession of Geoffroy, that was seen as as the next powerful contender among these powers. And as you understand here, Anjou is caught between two fires, right? Blois from the east and Brittany from the west. And especially Conan of Rennes,
in fact, had taken control of Nantes,
a city of great strategic importance because it controls the Loire estuary, and as we were seeing before, also the brethren, as you know, had participated together with the Normans at times. I mean, they had been mixed relations. So in truth, I made a video about the Duchy of Brittany recently with the Normans, etc. So the brethren had resumed some kind of pressure now on the Angevins, and that in fact held suzerainty on Nantes. So Fulk laid siege to Nantes, managed to rout the relief force of Conan's army at the Battle of Conquests on June the 27th, 992. Which is a very interesting battle because sources say that also the brethren had fortified their own camp with ditches filled with water, etc. In the first, there are different accounts actually that the Angevin cavalry charged into that. It was first repelled, then regrouped and reattack again. It's kind of a bit like Hastings, reminding at least vaguely. And other sources actually says that and that there was actually a different outcome. Some say that brought to a standstill. Others said that probably the Angevin counterattack managed to crush the britons. In any case, Nantes was brought again under Angevin control after that. So however it went, the brethren didn't have the force to retain control of the center. However, the major problem again was the Count of Blois, as Fulk the Red established a fortress at Angers, a few miles from Tours, and although was about to essentially overwhelm the Angevin fortress, but thanks to the intervention of the western Frankish king Hugh Capet, the Angevins could maintain the fortress, and that's quite interesting. Also because, frankly, the Capetian power was, just besides just across the county of Blois from the Angevin perspective, and that kind of strengthened in relative terms also the Capetians. At the death of Otto the First, Fulk the Red went further, managing to seize Tours in 996. So taking control factually of the Touraine, at least the most important center, most of it. However, at this point, King Robert the Pious thought it was too much and took himself to for himself, in fact, in 997. At this point, Fulk took instead the fortress of Montsoreau, and there was a further war in 1016 between Fulk and the new Count of Blois, Otto II. Otto II was defeated at Pont-le-Voix in the same year, on July the 6th, and in 1026, while he was besieging Montboyau, Fulk the Red surprised the Count again by taking Saumur, while he was operating elsewhere. The final victory over the Count of Blois was achieved by Geoffrey Martel, Count of Anjou, between June 21st, 1040 and November the 14th, 1060. He was the son and successor of Fulk the Red, and it was this victory was in fact won at Nuit on August the 21st, 1044, over Thibaud the Third, Count of Blois, securing the Angevin control over the county of Touraine. that had been bitterly contended, in fact, by to Blois. At the same time, Geoffrey Martel succeeded in extending the Angevin control over the countship of Men. The local ruler Henry Wakedog was captured in 1025, and in exchange for his freedom he made homage to the Count of Anjou, and the Count of Men is called Wakedog exactly because of the alacrity, let's say, with which he had the restlessness which he had watched over the Angevin incursions, trying to stem them on his territory. And Geoffrey Martel had been defeated when his father was still alive by Geoffrey de Château-du-Loir, that was bishop of Le Mans. This had occurred in 1038. However, almost 10 years later, he managed to take the prelate as prisoner as well, for which he was actually excommunicated at the Council of Rheims in October 1049 by Pope Leo IX. Also, Geoffrey Martel was a name is a tells everything, of course, just like the Charles Martel nickname was given because of the military capacity. Was a great rival of William the Bastard, right, the Duke of Normandy, and this was simply, obvious because of the Norman consolidation that had brought often to search for expansion in southwest, not all. And Geoffroy, in spite being attacked simultaneously by William of Normandy and the same Western Frankish king Henry I, he managed to see his authority on men recognized in 1051. He didn't have a chance to, let's say, take revenge over William of Normandy, but he still managed to defend his power and to extend it further. After Geoffroy, however, the delusion, in a sense, because he didn't have children. For this reason, he bequeathed the county of Anjou to his eldest nephew, Geoffrey III, nicknamed the Bearded, that was the son of Geoffroy, Count of Gâtinais, and of Ermengarde, who was actually a daughter of Fulk Nera, so they were connected by blood. However, Fulk le Rachant, the cross-looking, was brother of Geoffroy the Bearded, had initially been contending with him an appanage consisting of Saintonge and the Châtellenie of Villers, and this brought fundamentally to the let's say properly the taking over of Saintonge by the Duke of Aquitaine in 1062, but supported by Le Rachant, and this in turn triggered discontent in the countship against Geoffroy III, so that Fulk could exploit the disorder to make himself Lord of Saumur on February the 25th, 1067, and of the same Angers on April the 4th of the same year. Also, Geoffroy was imprisoned in Sablé. This caused a bit of trouble because the Pope even intervened at this point, and so the Geoffroy was released for a short while, but the struggle renewed itself again, and Fulk not only defeated Geoffroy near Brissac, but captured him again and imprisoned him at the castle of Chinon in 1068. At this point, Fulk was to be recognized Count of Anjou, because really there wasn't much that could be done to reverse the situation, and he would manage that so much that he's, in fact, Fulk the Fourth, Russian, ruling from de facto 1068 up to April the 14th, 1109. And in order to do this, he had to, first of all, pacify the internal situation. Not much, because again there was another, major rival at that point, but simply because of the unrest. So he fought against his barons. Also, he was to hand over his ancestral land of Gâtinais to the King Philip I of Western Francia, and even to make homage to the Count of Blois for the Countship of Touraine, which was kind of a important symbolical, kind of a humiliation, considering that the Angevins had managed to obtain the countship in arms at that point. But this was in fact positive overall, because Fulk consolidated his power. He especially kept intervening, as Geoffrey Martel had done importantly in Maine. He destroyed La Flèche, and finally he received the homage of Robert the Courtly, the son of William the Conqueror, for Maine at the Peace of Blancheland in 1081. So continuing also to Normandy, this frontier area between the two, the duchy and the county. Also, he upheld Elias, that was the Lord of La Flèche, against William Rufus, King of England, son of William the Conqueror, and this brought properly to the recognition of Elias to the Countship of Maine in 1100, plus the marriage of his son by Bertrade de Montfort, Fulk, the future Fulk the Fifth, so known as the Young, with Ermengarde, that was the Count of Maine, now Elias' daughter, and thus, and also sole heiress. So this sets the basis for an important dynastic sum, and the plan succeeded, as Fulk the Fifth, ruling up to 1129, succeeded to the Countship of Maine on the death of Elias in 1110, right? And later, in fact, to the county of Anjou. However, this was too much for the interests of the Anglo-Normans that control, in fact, the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy. And Henry I of England essentially went at war against the Anjou, because they actually had secured an important asset that could have threatened and would threaten, in fact, Normandy, as we see. The war broke out in 1112, and initially things went badly for Anjou, as Henry I managed to take Alençon, and also imprisoning Robert, Lord of Belem, who was an Anglo-Norman knight that was playing in this game and siding with the Anjou. And this brought to the homage of Fulk to Henry for men at the Treaty of Pierre Perculé near Alençon on February 23rd, 1113. This, however, was triggering a further worry by the Western Frankish king Louis VI the Fat, who intervened against Henry, overrunning the Vexin in 1118 and defeating the Anglo-Normans at Alençon in November the same year, and the following May obliging Henry to demand peace fundamentally, which was agreed the month later through a marriage of his eldest son William the Atheling with Matilda, that was Fulk's daughter. Now, in 1120, William the Atheling died in the famous wreckage of the White Ship. Fulk was returning from the Crusades that were staying between 1120 and 1121, and married his second daughter Sibyl on demand of Louis VI to William Clito, who was the son of Robert the Courtly, was a claimant to the duchy, giving her Maine as a dowry. This happened in 1122-23. And there was an agreement for the dissolution of this marriage, probably in the same year, the one after, that Henry I obtained, because this youth was kin, right? So there was properly no legal ground canonically for allowing their marriage. Nevertheless, and forces united again in 1127, and on May the 22nd at Rouen, Henry I betrothed his daughter Matilda, widow of the Emperor Henry V, to Geoffrey the Handsome, son of Fulk, one of the most important marriages in the history of Europe for its consequences, which was celebrated at Le Mans on June the 2nd, 1129. At this point, Fulk departed again for the Holy Land because he was called by Baldwin II of Jerusalem, and he married there his daughter Melisande, that was also heiress to the throne of Jerusalem, which fact Fulk was eventually crowned as king of on September the 14th, 1131. And his eldest son, Geoffrey V the Handsome, also known as the Plantagenet, would succeed him as Count of Anjou in 1129, ruling it up to September the 7th, 1151. This marriage was, as we've just said, dramatically important on historical ground. Geoffrey tried to profit immediately from his marriage, and after having defeated his same father-in-law, Henry I, on December the 1st, 1135, he essentially carried out it began at least the conquest of Normandy, that would be accomplished by a series of campaigns over the years. He, by the way, at the end of 1135 or beginning 1136, he properly invaded the land and also rejoined with his wife, Empress Matilda, who had received at this point by herself the submission of Argentan, Domfront, and Esme. And such a huge effort against Normandy triggered a revolt of the Angevin barons at the same time, parts of which supported the Anglo-Norman cause rather, and this brought in September 1136, Geoffrey to come back in Anjou with a strong army that had been reinforced by allies and other Norman elements even as well. This some among these more powerful allies was William Duke of Aquitaine, Geoffrey Count of Vendôme, William Talvas, Count of Ponthieu, and Geoffrey was also wounded in this war after some initial successes, but this accident at his foot at the siege of Les Saints on October the 1st forced him to fall back. But it would start over again. In 1137, Geoffrey launched a new campaign. Consider at this point he had also men and the support of part of Normandy now that would be readily brought down. In fact, he devastated the districts of Aux-Moines near Exmes, burned Bazoches to the ground. The year after, in June, with the support of Robert of Gloucester, Geoffrey obtained the submission of prestigious centers in Normandy, Bayeux and Caen. Also in October the same year, he put to sack the surroundings of Falaise. In March 1141, considering that his wife Matilda was winning contemporarily in England success, he launched a new expedition to Normandy. That was really the most important and the one actually bringing to the subjugation of the entire land. He was actually acclaimed at that point most in many parts of the country, and town after town surrendered because they realized also that from England couldn't quite arrive much of a support. So in the same year, Vernouilles, Nonancourt, Lisieux, Falaise. The year after, Mortain, Saint-Hilaire, Pontorson. In 1143, Avranches, Saint-Lô, Serrance, Coutances, Cherbourg. And at the beginning of 1144, he finally entered Rouen, the seat of the duchy, and on January the 19th, he received, in fact, the ducal crown in the Rouen Cathedral, thus sanctioning his control. In 1149 was a last attempt of revolt, and after this the Normans were tamed so much that Geoffrey obtained, actually at the hands of the King of France himself, as an investiture, for his son Henry Court-Mantel, the duchy of the ducal title of Normandy proper. And in the meanwhile, the same Fulk V and Geoffrey were extending the boundaries of the Anjou itself, in spite of this busy, especially Norman activity. In fact, the barons at this point were becoming somewhat more dangerous, if anything. It was the time in which the feudal nobility was gaining ever more power on its own, a great moment of expansion. And we have relatively to the two different documentation, especially less about the achievements of Fulk. We know that in 1109 Douai and l'Île Bouchard were taken. In 1112 there was the siege of Brissac, and also Échevad of Bruyères, more or less the same period, was subdued. In 1114 there was also another generalized baron uprising that was brought down, and in 1118 yet another one that was put down again after the siege of Bonmaison. In 1123 there was the revolt of Douai. The year after there was a 9 weeks siege and Angevin victory over Montreuil-Bellay. Geoffroy was really an indefatigable leader, and he also fought importantly to suppress some uprisings of his vassals. The most important one was in 1129. There were really very important figures that were and places that were rebelling at this time, such as Guy the Fourth of Laval, Giraud II of Montreuil-Bellay, Viscount of Thouars, the lords of Mirabeau, Amboise, Parthenay, Sablé. And Geoffroy defeated them in detail, all, right? He raised the keep of Thouars, also took possession of Mirabeau, so it was an incredibly effective political and strategic achievement to bring order, to reduce the order, all these lords, and that would keep on rebelling, by the way, and being defeated. So that's the hammering aspect of this all. In 1134 was yet another rising, which brought to the destruction of Caen and the Angevin control of the Ile Bouchard. In 1136, while the Count of Anjou was in Normandy, Robert III of Sablé rose again as the leader of the revolt. Geoffroy answered by destroying Briolet and occupying La Suze, so much that Robert of Sablé surrendered. He asked for mercy, right? And there was an intercession of the Bishop of Angers also in the process, right? So this ostensible public humiliations, let's say, and subjugations were deep, deep spectacles in a time where this nobleman really didn't bow to anyone. This would beg humbly for pardon, right after having revolt. Also in 1139, Geoffroy took Mirabeau, once again, in 1142, Champtoussault. But in 1145 was yet another revolt, and this time it came under the leadership of Elias. It was Saint Count's own brother, who, being supported by the aforementioned Robert of Sablé, it's a mistake to have such feelings like common human mercy, also laid claim, in virtue of his blood, to the countship of men altogether. That, as we've seen, was this, third chunk of the broader continental Angevin possession. Geoffroy managed to imprison Elias. Also, Robert of Sablé was beaten yet again, and this time he retreated, probably he fled. The other barons were finally brought to reason, right? There were other operations. In 1147, Geoffroy destroyed Douai and Blaison. In 1150, there was another revolt led by Giraud, Lord of Montreuil-Bellay, and the siege of the place lasted for 1 year, which was an enormous deal at the time. Normally, sieges lasted, if anything, a season. If it were so long, it was already extraordinary, right? So the effort that here the Angevins deployed was immense. Also, reflecting their power, their resources, indeed. Giraud was taken, the garrison surrendered. The leader was taken prisoner and released at that point only because the Western Frankish king mediated for his liberation. So what we know eventually with Henry II Plantagenet, right, King of England, from 1154, is that at his father's death on September the 7th, 1151, he was left with a massive asset that had been, as we've seen, by this indefatigable repression of any form of dissent or rebellion, strong, consolidated, by the way, in some of the richest areas of Europe, the Atlantic plains of northern France, right, into which his marriage with Eleanor of Aquitaine, former French queen, on May 1152, further added the entire Aquitaine. So here we talk, generally speaking, of the Angevin Empire, which naturally opens to another phase in properly in the history of the county, because this became part of a broader system that eventually collapsed, but still was very influential. Also because, frankly, the English barons were fundamentally French and also preferred to stay in France rather than in England, and later also because this was such a well-administered area that it would have influences also in the same Capetian administration when, as we'll see now, when they took control. Henry became King of England with the Treaty of Wallingford, but at this point Geoffrey was Count of Nantes, and he was his brother, and had received as an appanage the three fortresses of Chinon, Loudun, and Mirebeau, claimed suzerainty of Anjou because of the will of their father. In fact, the paternal inheritance should have had to descend to him, Geoffrey, if Henry had succeeded not obtaining the possession of the maternal inheritance, right? And Henry was actually, he had sworn to observe their father's will, but he got a dispensation from the Pope, and thus he could go against the oath, and he moved war in France against his brother. In fact, in 1156 he managed to take Chinon and Mirebeau. In July, he even forced Geoffrey to give up the three fortresses in exchange for an annual revenue, right? This is interesting because some of the most advanced feudal states at the time would essentially try this to avoid this traditional dynastic, branches subdivision by compensating with some fact a pension. Normally, Burgundy would do this too, etc. So this provided naturally Henry with a ever more solid control, and in fact he had over the county of Anjou for all his life. And even after having granted it in 1168 to his son Henry the Young King, he would even when his son came of age, so he would be able to rule the land, he prohibited him to do so, right? So he cared particularly, especially about the county of Anjou, and even also these means had been done maybe to avoid some baronial rebellion, etc., in the heart of his possessions, etc. Also because it was not that easy to, there were probably some reasons for which the county of Anjou was so successful. So he was fundamentally in the hinterland. He could receive an important support from the King of France at the same time, and from the north, from Normandy especially, it wasn't easy to reach. It was men in between, right? So there were some probably strategical, as well as of course political reasons for this. And as we've seen, it was the county of Anjou who had successfully managed to take over Maine, Normandy, etc. After Henry II's death in 1189, the County of Anjou passed to his son Richard Lionheart, Richard I, that died 10 years later. In this point, Arthur of Brittany, that was born in 1187 and was actually descending of, it was the son of Geoffrey, fourth son of Henry II. So he thought that he would have to inherit the county in itself by, a more archaic concept of succession, that was the one for which the son of the eldest brother should succeed. So not the main line, but actually the older kind of almost tribal idea that it was the brothers. So it's a kind of more egalitarian thing that would have to control first, even then the other brothers descend the land, and this was essentially going generation after generation. So this brought the contrast with John of England, the youngest son of Henry II, for which he could claim that superiority, because otherwise it would have in fact been in the same generational step of the ladder. And as such, as Duke of Brittany was supported on his Angevin ambitions, about his Angevin ambition, by Philip II Augustus of France, right? Also aided by William de Roche, that had been essentially the seneschal of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine for the same John, and that kind of, turned his side instead. So Arthur entered Angers finally on April the 18th, 1199, and he was recognized of not just of the as Count of Anjou, but also of the one of Maine and of Touraine, for which in fact he made homage to Philip. John at this point passed to the counteroffensive, and given that the fact that by the Treaty of Le Goulet of May the 22nd, 1200, that basically brought to peace between France and England, and established therefore some temporary peace, and this had essentially made the French bailing out of the Breton coast, so that Arthur was at this point not recognized by Philip II and his claims on Anjou, and John at this point in fact managed to take control of the county. He was recognized properly as count in Angers itself on June the 18th, 1200. This English Angevin Capetian balance was not to last. However, as in 1202 John refused to make homage to Philip Augustus, and as a consequence the Western Frankish king banned John as a traitor fundamentally, and confiscated all of his continental possessions, including Anjou, which only at this point was given to Arthur by the French. And yet Arthur was defeated at Mirabeau on August 1st, 1202, imprisoned. This seemed to ensure John's control fully. That's at this point that William de Roche defected and to the French, and helped Philip Augustus the year after to subdue all of them. And as you know, we also made a video on this in the campaign of 1214 that would culminate with the Battle of Bouvines, but also of the Roche-aux-Moines on July the 2nd, marks this definitive loss, fundamentally, of the continental possessions. The English side, John had managed the same year, on June the 17th, to reoccupy Angers with his forces, but he was defeated by the relief force sent by the French at La Roche-aux-Moines. Was besieged by John. And so this changed the whole game. As you know, continental possessions, in fact, were lost. This brought to France taking off as the major power in Europe quite easily. At that point, found practically no competitor in this, and this brought the County of Anjou to lose, naturally, its own autonomy, but not its importance, because in 1246 Louis IX, King of France, gave the county as an appanage to his brother Charles, who was already Count of Provence. It was not a French territory, was part of the Kingdom of Arles. Also, Charles, as you know, we made a video about him, became King of Sicily after defeating the Hohenstaufen there with the papal support. And as a consequence, Anjou was framed within this broader Angevin system. Now, this was also an Angevin empire. So it was ironic how, historiographically speaking, right, the latter Angevin empire was actually even more, more lasting and even more important than the first one. But we remember just the first one in these terms. The Angevins came eventually to rule over Greece, over became the ruling dynasty in Hungary, in Poland. Right, they had important infiltrations in central northern Italy, and so on. And Charles himself gave little thought to the county as a consequence. Also, his son, Charles II Lane, who succeeded him on January 7th, 1285, but ruled from Naples. And on August the 16th, 1290, Charles the Lame married his daughter Margaret, the Countess of Anjou, to Charles of Valois. That was son of Philip III of France, who also died in the fight against the Aragonese. And this brought the Anjou and men to become Margaret's dowry in the marriage, in exchange for Charles of Valois' claims, in fact, on Aragon and Valencia, as well as on the Countship of Barcelona, that had been invaded, in fact, by Philip. The latter, especially, been invaded by Philip III, where he was. Then there was we made a video about the Crown of Aragon in general. Maybe we'll have to talk about the single chunks, but also about the French intervention in southern France, in Occitania, that was this important infiltration from Iberia. Had been a thing since the times of, from a long time, from ever, but especially had crushed against the renewed Western French, at this point, expansionism, also during the Albigensian Crusade, etc. Now, Charles of Valois, as a consequence, simply took control of the county of Anjou, to which Philip IV, in September 1297, attached a peerage of France. It was essentially a title recognized to the highest nobility of France, and that Anjou, for which Anjou was properly recognized, because being essentially, in fact, this branch of the same Capetian dynasty. Now, on December 16, 1325, Charles of Valois died, So this left the Anjou to his eldest son Philip of Valois, that was to become Philip VI of France on April the 1st, 1328, for which the Countship of Anjou was fundamentally again united to the crown, as it had been technically since the time of Philip II to the time of Louis IX as well. Then things went on as the duchy would be created later in the 14th century, and finally in 1482 it would become itself part properly of the Kingdom of France, remaining this province until fundamentally the French Revolution. So you understand how effectively the Capetians after Bouvines took everything and managed properly to centralize to a level that, if you see even just up to a few generations before, how old the struggle to put those fiefs, to those factual seigneuries, kind of states within the same broader state together, makes you really say, damn, this did they deserve it? Yeah, they kind of did, because they were also working pretty hard in their own Ile-de-France, etc. In any case, well, these are other personal considerations, but it's always interesting to look at them in some detail. And what is fascinating about the County of Anjou in general is also the early period, like the compaction in the 10th, in the 11th century, when this was just a minor, it was just a county, right? But it made it to the top of the French vassals at the time, and so because of a remarkable military inclination of the ruling dynasty, and well, not much differently from the rest of Western France at this point, but still in a way that strikes, right? Because you wouldn't, considering especially the neighbors, Brittany was a big one, right? If you look at the maps, even I have inserted here, you realize it's incumbent. It doesn't even properly open to the Atlantic. It has Angers that is surrounded by as many other centers: Rennes, Le Mans, Tours, Nantes. Poitou was, as we've seen, not much of a problem, but I'd say was pressured, especially from this great arc in the north from east to west that enclosed it, right? And still it was the one who managed fundamentally to take over one by one the Touraine, Maine, as we've seen, also Normandy, and then later also Aquitaine and the other massive amount of fiefs, the same Poitou, the County of La Manche, the County of Limoges, the County of Périgord, same Gascony, Duchy of Gascony, the County of Auvergne, that arrived up to the Kingdom of Ar, right? So in the east. So this corridor also between Brittany, that in part was also taken by the Angevins, as you know, we made a video about Brittany, and Normandy in the north, plus England. So really a hell of an empire that does bear the title of the Angevin one. Not because actually the center of power at that point was Anjou anymore, was mainly England, and the important, also Normandy was more important. As we've seen, the Angevins managed to take over Normandy because they were exploiting also the civil war in England, right? And then Aquitaine was immense too, with all its possessions. So this is in a sense, the real Middle Ages, what you can see as something extremely difficult, actually, in management, in properly in statal construction, but it was done, right? It was done for the world today to be still essentially based on these identities too, because politically it was engineered from that, right? And this is in fact yet another case of we could distinguish between something more ethnic in political identity and something more kind of emerging administratively, right? And the County of Anjou definitely didn't correspond to yes, of course, it was a province on its own, but say it's not like saying like this was a I don't know, the Normandy was at least settled by the Normans. It was a particular thing. Brittany was probably another country, right? We've seen it recently with other polities, like the Dutch of Austria. It was probably not just created from scratch as an administrative center, but also ethnically Germanized on the long run, because before there weren't even the same people that would eventually speak the German language there, etc. So this is the power, if you want, of something random, but it's not random also in the essence of it all. This is not really a paradox game where almost everything can happen, right? The degree by which this happened was much more heavily rooted to some sort of mass, let's say, of concentrated conditions could afford very gradually these powers to emerge. But anyhow, this is just a bit of ranting at the end of the video. For today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.